The water pump might seem like a minor nuisance to you at times, but it can cause some pretty massive damage, like it did on the Sedco 472. That's why rebuilding it right is so important. The water pump has always been one of the weak points in the EMD. Most of the failure reports that we get in Dallas on water pumps are bearing-related problems. So EMD introduced a new sealed bearing to help improve the life and reliability of the pump. This bearing comes separately or as a part of their repair kit. Like I said, most of the problems you'll see with the water pump will be bearings, and they're usually pretty easy to determine. Mac McGee has some tips for you on this.
Basically, there's not any real good way of troubleshooting a water pump. The main thing is you'll find that the engine's not cooling, and of course, naturally, the first thing you suspect would be a water pump. The other is, as you go around through your engine room, get accustomed to the noises that these engines create. As you walk past the front end of this engine and the noise sounds different to what it did yesterday, then go and check the water pump. You can take a screwdriver and put against this part of the housing for the bearing next to the gear train, or this part of the housing for the bearing out next to the impeller, with your ear against the other end of the screwdriver, and you can definitely hear the bearings running in that water pump. If you don't hear anything unusual there or don't recognize it, go to the other side of the engine and try that water pump. Most assuredly, both of the water pumps are not going out at the same time. If you hear a different noise on the other side than you do this side, whichever one's the roughest, that's the water pump that must be giving you the problem. One of the other things to look at is possible discoloration in this area right here. When you get that discoloration, that bearing has already failed. It's going out on you completely. The water pump is overheated in that area, and you need to shut the engine down immediately. If you do not change this water pump, you stand a chance on the gear of the water pump getting out of alignment with the other gears in the accessory housing. And the first thing you know, you've got a split accessory housing, which means all of the stuff on the front of the engine has got to be reinstalled and realigned.
The water pump's important, and it'll last longer if you do the overhaul right. Before you start your overhaul, make sure that you have a full EMD water pump repair kit. In addition to the bearings, it comes with most everything you'll need: the gaskets, seals, self-locking nuts and bolts. It's all in there. It's kit number 954768-3. Now don't skimp by trying to replace just the bearings. Compared to the price of a new water pump or the price of 8 power assemblies, it's cheap. In 1983, the full kit listed for $102, so don't skimp. When the PMS calls for an overhaul, put the full kit in. The removal and installation are pretty straightforward, but do remember to drain the cooling system before you go taking one off.
You remove this dresser sleeve back, take this line down, both ends of this line, remove the bolts around the face of the water pump where it goes on to the accessory drive housing, and slip the water pump out and bring it out of there.
What we're really interested in is the disassembly, the inspection, and the reassembly of the pump. Let's start with the tools. Some of them are special tools, but they're things you can make pretty easily on the rig. These two, for example. They help drive the bearings onto and off of the shaft. This green one's a 2-inch diameter pipe, 10 inches long. One end's got a plate welded over it. The red one's a 2-inch diameter pipe, 8 3/4 inches long. Notice that this wall has been beveled down on the inside diameter. We'll be using the gear puller, rubber mallet. The manual calls for a rawhide mallet, but this one works just as good, and various sockets and wrenches. And you'll need your repair kit. Before we start on disassembling the water pump, let's take a quick look at how it's made. The water pump shaft is held in the casing by 2 bearing assemblies. These bearing assemblies are spaced apart by a bearing spacer. The inner bearing is held in place by a retainer and snap ring to absorb the thrust in the shaft. On one end of the shaft is the drive gear. On the other end is the impeller. Both are locked to the shaft by woodruff keys and held in place with self-locking nuts. There's an elaborate sealing system on the impeller end. It's made up of a carbon seal that seats against a smooth inner surface. It's held in place with a spring. Let's get started on overhauling the water pump. The mechanic on board this rig has strung a cable from the ceiling to suspend the water pump. This really helps make disassembly easier. He's also built a couple of handy mounts that help him in the overhaul. Let's take a quick look. This box is used to suspend the pump so that the bearing assembly can be dropped into place, allowing gravity to help keep it straight so that it doesn't bind, and so that the shaft can drop straight down without hitting anything. This pump support bracket was designed by one of the mechanics on the Sedco 471. It's pretty easy to make, and it makes torquing and untorquing the shaft nuts a lot easier without damaging the teeth. It's made out of a damaged idler gear. 1/6 of the gear has been cut out here and welded to a mount so that the pump drive gear is locked in place when the pump is bolted on. If you don't have a damaged idler gear, a half of a damaged drive gear will work just as good. The first thing you want to do is loosen the impeller nuts and suspend the pump gear end upwards so that it just clears the workbench. Then remove them. Once the nuts are off, the housing might let loose on its own. This one did. If it doesn't, use your rubber or rawhide mallet to wrap it and break it loose. Make sure that your water pump isn't more than a few inches from your workbench so that when the impeller housing drops off, it doesn't fall very far and get damaged. Once you've removed the housing, you can pull the pump off of your support. And now would probably be a good time to inspect that impeller. You want to be watching for problems like this. Things like this will cause the pump to be unbalanced and could cause other damage inside of the pump if it's reused. Be sure to look very carefully for any signs of damage at all that might cause the impeller to be unbalanced. Next, you'll need to mount the pump so that the drive gear and the impeller can be removed. We're going to use this little device because it doesn't damage the drive gear teeth. If you don't have the materials to make one of these, you could place the mounting flange of the pump in a vise using jaw protectors. Next, pull the drive gear nut and washer. Be careful not to damage the gear teeth if you're using a vise. Before you take it off, you also want to remove the impeller end nut and washer. Now, the drive end nut and the impeller end nut are both self-locking. They should only be used once. If you reuse one, there's a good chance that it'll loosen and come off inside the engine. There's the result of something like that happening. This drive gear loosened while it was operating inside of the engine. The vibration of the loose gear broke these teeth and these teeth on the idler gear. This type of repair, if this pump can be salvaged, will end up costing thousands of dollars and a lot of man-hours. So when you take these nuts off, be sure you throw them away. After you've got the two nuts taken off, you'll need to use your gear puller to pull the drive gear off. It's held in place with a woodruff key. So you'll need to be sure and get the key out too. Next, you'll want to remove the bearing snap ring and bearing retainer ring. There's one thing you might notice here. Take a good close look at the edge of the housing. This one's been chipped and eaten away. We'll take a closer look at it a little later, but this housing may have to be replaced. Next, you'll want to put your gear puller or impeller puller on the impeller end of the shaft. Now, notice here that we're putting the legs across the outer housing and not on the impeller itself. If your impeller is any good, you'll damage it by putting the legs on the impeller. As you press the shaft out of the housing, the impeller will release and you'll be able to take it off of the shaft. You'll also free the shaft up as the bearings disengage from the housing. It's a good idea, once the shaft reaches this point, to go ahead and pull the impeller off and remove the impeller shaft key and the seals. The seals consist of a spring, a seal retainer, an outer seal, and a carbon seal. When you're rebuilding your water pump, these are some of the main items that are replaced. A little light tapping with a block of wood, and you'll be able to easily work the shaft and bearings out of the housing. Now, don't hit it hard. If it locks up on you, it's because it's coming out crooked. Try to straighten the shaft out as much as you can, and then continue to tap lightly with your block of wood. It shouldn't take a lot of force to get this out. The next step is to remove the stationary bushing. It's held in place by 6 bolts at the rear of the water pump. This is replaced too because the bottom surface is what the carbon seal seals against. If there are any scratches or scores at all, the seal won't have integrity. Once the 6 bolts have been removed from the stationary bushing, it may or may not come off easily. If it's stuck, maybe a few taps with a rubber mallet will loosen it. If not, there are 2 threaded back-off accesses. You can use the bushing bolts to back the stationary bushing off of the pump housing. The next step is to remove the bearings because we're going to replace them. The inner bearing has a snap ring groove, the rear one doesn't. Now, the shaft assembly consists of the shaft, the water slinger, the outer bearing, the bearing spacer, and the inner bearing. On the older bearings, both the inner and outer bearings are designed with an offset on one side. These offsets should always be positioned to the outside of the shaft. If you have any question as to which side we're talking about, the part number is stamped on the offset side. That part number should always point to the outside of the shaft. The new bearings are offset on both sides. Don't forget that the inner bearing has this snap ring too. Mount the shaft assembly in your vise with jaw protectors holding on to the bearing spacer. Attach your gear puller to the inner bearing and you can carefully pull the bearing off. Be careful not to drop the assembly when the inner bearing comes off. Then the bearing spacer will slide off. This tool that we were talking about earlier was made in the shop. It fits down over the bearing shaft assembly, and you'll notice that the edge has been tapered off so that it matches the taper on the water slinger. We're able to drive the bearing off easier with this thing without damaging the water slinger. This tool will only drive it off of its own bearing seat. Use the gear puller to pull it off of the other bearing seat. Once this is done, you'll need to give the shaft a good inspection. In fact, all the parts ought to undergo a very close inspection to determine whether or not they are reusable. Now, remember a little earlier, we were talking about this part of the housing. If you take a good close look, you'll see that there's a discoloration near the bearing area, and it looks like some parts of the neck have been overheated and chipped away. Whatever caused it, it's obvious that it'll have to be scrapped. Here, compare it to a new housing. See the difference? And also inspect the impeller for any damage at all. An unbalanced impeller will cause a lot of damage real fast. Be sure to inspect the impeller housing. Before reinstalling an impeller, check to make sure that all of its parameters are right. There has to be the proper clearance between the impeller neck and the impeller housing. Check the drive gear to make sure that the gear teeth aren't worn and to make sure there are no chips or cracks in the teeth. You'll want to check the wear on the gear shaft hole too. And be sure and check the impeller shaft. If it's out of round at all, you'll either need to replace it or have it turned. Now, let's put the pump back together. The first step is to reassemble the bearing shaft assembly. The water slinger goes on first. Now, take a good close look at the way that this is being installed here. Next comes the inner bearing. EMD's introduced a new bearing that uses a seal. This seal helps to keep the grease in the bearing area and will hopefully help extend its life for you. With these installed in the water pump, you should get well over 4,200 hours out of them. You can order the bearings with a new water pump repair kit. Here's the part number: 954768-3. This kit includes the gear end bearing and the impeller end bearing, as well as all of the seals and gaskets you'll need to rebuild the water pump. It also includes a new stationary bushing. We recommend that whenever you rebuild a water pump, replace all of these parts with the new kit. A little silicone grease on the bearing seating surfaces will make it easier to get the bearings installed. Here we're installing the old style bearings, but you'll probably be using the new style. The inner bearing is the one that does not have the snap ring groove. It can be installed either way if you're using the new style. If you're using the old style, there's an offset that should point to the outside of the shaft. A few easy taps. Be careful to make sure the bearing is going down straight on the shaft. Light taps should be all that's needed to get the bearing seated. If you have trouble driving it on, it may be because it's cocked. Be sure it's going on straight. You'll need to drive it down all the way, flush against the water slinger. Next, the bearing spacer sleeve goes on. It can go either way. Then, finally, the outer bearing, the one with the snap ring groove. The offset points outward. The snap ring goes to the outward side. Again, a few taps on the bearing will cause it to seat right into place. Once you've got this bearing on, check the bearing spacer to make sure that it's snug. And make sure that the bearings turn freely. Here, the spacer turns too easily, so we're going to have to snug it up a little bit. Now, that's about right. Be sure that both bearings turn freely. Next, set the water pump housing in a holder of some type. Before you install the shaft assembly, be sure to put silicone grease on the bearing seat surfaces. This will help when you install the assembly by helping to lubricate the surfaces as the bearings are driven through the housing. A little silicone grease on the inner bearing itself is a good idea too. Now you'll need to tap the shaft into place, slinger in first. It's going to be a tight fit, but you don't have to use a lot of force, just moderate taps. As you seat the outer bearing in the outer seat, make sure that the shaft is perfectly straight. Then go ahead and drive the shaft and bearing assembly all the way down until the snap ring meets the groove that holds it in place. Once the bearings in the shaft have seated themselves, install the bearing retainer ring and the snap ring. Make sure the snap ring seats all the way. Once you've got the snap ring in place, make sure that the shaft still turns freely. The next thing to be installed is the stationary bushing. Make sure it's perfectly clean. This gasket goes between the bushing and the housing. You should use those 6 special self-locking bolts on this bushing. As you tighten the bolts down, make sure you tighten them in the right pattern. Tighten them to 50 inch-pounds first. Then torque them down to 100 inch-pounds, or 11.3 Newton-meters. Once you've got them torqued down, make sure that the sealed surface area is completely clean. Before you install the rest of the seal, you need to check the runout on the carbon seal to make sure that it's seating right. You do this with a micrometer. Check it out to specifications in your EMD manual. First, we'll install the carbon seal like this. Again, make sure everything is perfectly clean. There are 2 feet on the seal retainer that fit into notches in the carbon seal. The flat side of the outer seal should contact the carbon seal. The concave side should fit up against the inside of the seal retainer ring. Make sure those little feet seat down inside the slots in the carbon seal. Before you install the seal spring, you'll want to put the impeller key in place and check the depth of the key against the shaft key seat to make sure that there's clearance. The narrow end of the spring goes in first, and this foot on the spring fits into the tab of the seal retainer. Now we can install the impeller on the shaft. Notice when you get this installed that the large end spring foot fits into a notch in the impeller. You'll need to make sure that this seats while you're installing the impeller. The best way to do this is just make sure that the foot is positioned 180 degrees away from the impeller shaft key. Otherwise, the impeller won't seat. Now we can install the drive gear key and the drive gear. When you're installing this gear, make sure you put it on the right way. If you look at both sides of the gear, you'll notice that one side has a deeper inset than the other side. The deeper inset should go toward the housing. Next, secure the assembly. Both of these nuts have got self-locking devices on them. You should only use them once, then they should be thrown away. New ones are not included with the kit, so you'll have to order them separately. There have been a lot of pumps in the field that have been damaged because one of these nuts came loose. We've already put the drive gear washer on. This nut gets torqued down to 265 foot-pounds. On the other end, we install the impeller end nut and washer. This nut gets torqued down to 80 foot-pounds. All that remains now is to install the impeller housing into the main housing. The housing gasket goes on first. Notice on the impeller housing, molded in the housing itself, there's the letter R, and if you turn the housing around about 120 degrees, you'll find the letter L. If this is going to be a right side pump, line the diamond stamped into the pump housing up with the R. If it's going to be a left side pump, line the diamond up with the L. This particular pump will be a left side. Make sure that this spring and roll pin are in place over the tattletale hole at the drive gear end of the pump housing. If the balls in the ball bearing break apart, this spring will keep them from falling into the gear train area of the engine. All that's left is to torque these nuts down to 65 foot-pounds or 88 Newton-meters. Wrap a protective cloth around the teeth of the drive gear and cover the ports of the pump so that nothing falls down inside of it while it's in storage. If you're going to go ahead and put this back in the engine, you don't need to cover the ports. And finally, you'll want to paint the case to keep it from rusting. If you're installing this pump,
one of the first things you want to make sure of is that your gasket surfaces here, here, and here are clean. You install the water pump, tighten these bolts up into the housing. Next thing is you put on this discharge elbow. You need to start all of these bolts, and you start these 4 bolts, and then you tighten them up equally until you've got them both tight and you don't break this flange on this line. The next thing, you install this dresser sleeve. The only thing that you've got to be cautious of in this dresser sleeve is to make sure that the rubber seals under those clamps are pliable. If those rubber seals are not soft, you need to change them and get some seals in there that when you clamp up, will be sealed off from the water in these areas. Okay, when you're overhauling this water pump, either taking it off, overhauling it, or reinstalling it, be sure that you have your instruction manual out for anything that you're not completely familiar with. Do all of your work on this water pump according to the prescribed manner.
That's about it for the water pump. Be sure you do a good job because a faulty one can cause a lot of damage.